Between Jesus at age 12 teaching in the Jerusalem temple and his appearance at the Jordan River at age 30, the Gospels do not simply skip 18 years. They withhold more than 80% of his earthly life in a single breath. We instinctively search this void for lost travels, hidden scrolls, or a suppressed biography. But the silence is not a historical accident, nor is it a secret waiting to be uncovered. What we mistake for an absence is actually the most deliberate design in ancient literature. Our modern culture is obsessed with completeness. We expect biographies to account for every formative milestone, cataloging childhood diaries, adolescent crises, and personal journals to explain how a figure became who they were. When we open the New Testament and find that nearly 2 decades of Jesus of Nazareth are passed over in utter silence, our first impulse is suspicion or confusion. We assume that something has gone missing, that early church councils excised uncomfortable chapters, or that the gospel writers simply lacked the information to tell the full story. To understand what is actually happening, we must step away from modern expectations and step into the material reality of the first-century Mediterranean world. Picture a scribe seated on a low stool under the dry, angled light of an ancient workshop, carefully unrolling a sheet of coarse papyrus made from pressed Nile reeds. Every column of script required immense labor, and every vial of ink ground from soot and gum was an expensive commodity. In this world, parchment was not used to capture idle musings or background color. Every line committed to the scroll was chosen with deliberate silence and fierce intentionality. This intentional restraint has troubled curious minds since the earliest centuries. As early as the 2nd century, early Christians produced alternative writings known as the Apocryphal infancy Gospels. Texts like the Infancy Gospel of Thomas attempted to manufacture stories for the missing years portraying a supernatural child who turned clay sparrows into living birds or struck down playmates in fits of temper. In modern times, speculative theories have imagined Jesus traveling across the Silk Roads to monasteries in Tibet or learning mysticism in the temples of Egypt and Alexandria. Yet when we examine the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we find a startling and sober contrast. The biblical authors offer no childhood miracles, no secret journeys to distant lands, and no dramatic exploits during his teenage years. Luke closes the temple narrative with a single, unadorned sentence, stating that Jesus returned to Nazareth, remained submissive to his parents, and increased in wisdom, in stature, and in favor with God and people. Then, without explanation or apology, the historical curtain falls and does not rise again for 18 years. This silence is neither an oversight nor a cover-up. It is a profound theological statement. What we mistake for an absence is in fact an intentional spotlight shining only on what the writers deemed essential. The 4 gospel writers were not writing comprehensive modern biographies. They were constructing a focused theological testimony. If they chose to leave 18 years unrecorded, it was because the silence itself carried a weight just as vital as the public miracles that followed. To unlock the mystery of these silent years, we do not need to invent forgotten scrolls or search distant continents. We need only examine the ancient world as it actually existed, the scriptures that shaped Jesus' Jewish world, and the unrecorded fidelity of a craftsman living out the sacred ordinary in the hills of Galilee. The reason the Gospels felt silent begins with the very way ancient writers understood the measure of a life. When modern historians read the Gospels, they frequently compare them to the standard literary works of the first-century Roman world. In that era, the dominant form of biographical writing was known as the Greco-Roman Bios. If you read the biographies of Roman emperors written by Suetonius, or the famous Parallel Lives by Plutarch, you immediately notice a consistent pattern. Ancient biographers were not interested in what we would call developmental psychology. They did not document a subject's early childhood tantrums, schoolroom friendships, or adolescent soul-searching, because antiquity believed a person's fundamental character was fixed at birth and demonstrated only through public deeds. A Roman historian chronicling the life of Julius Caesar or Caesar Augustus would leap over decades of youth in a few sentences. Moving directly to the moment the leader assumed the civic toga, entered the Senate, or led legions into battle. The four gospel writers were writing within this established literary horizon. When Mark opens his narrative, he does not even mention the birth of Jesus. He begins directly with John the Baptist crying out in the wilderness. When Matthew, Luke, and John compose their accounts, they write not to satisfy casual curiosity about a private life, but to proclaim a public coronation. The intentional restraint of the gospel writers was a deliberate literary choice, signaling to every ancient reader that the story truly began when the public mission commenced. This literary silence is rooted in the Hebrew scriptures as well. Consider the life of Moses. In the book of Exodus, we read of his dramatic rescue from the Nile as an infant, followed immediately by his defense of a Hebrew slave as a grown man. Decades of royal education in Pharaoh's palace are summarized in mere verses. When Moses flees to Midian, 40 full years of tending sheep in the desert vanish into absolute quiet before the burning bush ignites. The biblical tradition never treated silence as empty space. It treated unrecorded time as the silent forge where character was tempered away from the eyes of the world. Looking past the literary structure brings us to a compelling historical and cultural question. Why did Jesus begin his public ministry precisely at around 30 years of age? Why not at 18, 21, or 25, when youthful vigor and energy were at their height? In the ancient Jewish world, 30 was not an arbitrary number. It was the sacred threshold of mature authority. Under the Mosaic law outlined in the book of Numbers, Levites were strictly forbidden from carrying the sacred furnishings of the tabernacle or entering full priestly service until they reached 30 years of age. A young man could study the Torah and assist in minor duties, but he could not bear the heavy, consecrated weight of the sanctuary until his third decade. Age 30 represented the confluence of physical stamina, seasoned judgment, and communal credibility. The Hebrew Scriptures reinforced this benchmark across centuries of covenant history. Joseph was 30 years old when he emerged from the Egyptian dungeon to stand before Pharaoh and govern the empire. King David was 30 years old when he was anointed over all Israel at Hebron. The prophet Ezekiel received his vision of the heavens opening by the river Chebar in his 30th year. In the conservative villages of first-century Galilee, a man under 30 could not command the communal respect required of a recognized rabbi or spiritual master. For Jesus to emerge onto the public stage before his 30th year would have violated the very cultural and scriptural patterns he came to fulfill. Those 18 years were not an empty waiting room, but a period of unrecorded fidelity to the Torah and the rhythm of Jewish community life. In an ancient culture that revered gray hair and proven endurance, authority was not claimed overnight. It was forged through years of patient obedience, quiet observation, and steady devotion in the local synagogue. And this brings us to the deepest, most grounding reason of all, the physical reality of the craftsman's bench in the hills of Lower Galilee. In the Gospel of Mark, when Jesus returns to preach in his hometown, the astonished villagers do not ask where he acquired his mysterious philosophies. They ask a simple, grounded question: is not this the Tekton, the son of Mary? The Greek word Tekton is often translated simply as carpenter, but in first-century Palestine, it meant far more. A Tekton was an artisan of raw materials, working with heavy timber, chiseling local limestone, and building the physical infrastructure of rural life. Nazareth was not a bustling metropolis. It was a rugged agricultural hamlet of perhaps 200 to 400 people, clinging to the rocky ridges of Galilee. For 18 years, Jesus' daily world consisted of sawing olive wood, shaping wooden plows, fitting yoke beams for oxen, and hauling stones to build terraced field walls. Sometime during these silent decades, the historical record indicates another profound shift. Joseph disappears entirely from the narrative. In ancient Jewish society, when a father died, the heavy legal and financial burden of providing for the household fell squarely upon the eldest son. Jesus was not living in secluded monastic contemplation or traveling to exotic foreign lands. He was waking before sunrise, negotiating prices for cedar and stone, paying the imperial taxes demanded by Rome, and working with calloused, bleeding hands to put bread on the table for his mother and younger siblings. This is the profound perception shift that shatters our modern expectations. What we mistake for an absence is actually the profound mystery of the Incarnation lived out in obscurity. If the Gospels recorded 18 years of spectacular miracles and world-spanning adventures in Nazareth, they would have undermined the very essence of his humanity. By remaining silent, the Gospel writers honor the sacred ordinary. They tell us that God did not merely drop into human history to give speeches and perform wonders. He spent the vast majority of his life living the repetitive, difficult, unglamorous existence of a common laborer. We must be historically honest about what the ground beneath Nazareth can and cannot give us. Modern archaeology has unearthed first-century terraced dwellings, domestic stone cisterns, and storage caves carved into the Galilean limestone. We can analyze the chisel marks on local soft chalk vessels and examine the charred remains of ancient olive wood from ancient hearths. Yet there is no workshop floor bearing the name of Jesus, no preserved ledger recording his family's trade, and no private letter surviving in the dry winds of the Levant. The historical record gives us the physical stage, the red clay soil, the iron adze, the heavy cedar beams, but it cannot provide a day-by-day diary of his thoughts at 20, or his personal sorrow when Joseph was laid to rest. Scholars also point to the dynamic worlds surrounding Nazareth. Just 4 miles north, the Roman client king Herod Antipas was actively rebuilding the grand Hellenistic city of Sepphoris during these exact decades, employing thousands of regional stonemasons, carpenters, and artisans. It is historically probable that a craftsman from nearby Nazareth walked those Roman roads and labored on regional building projects, witnessing firsthand the stark collision between traditional Jewish piety and imperial Roman luxury. But biblical scholarship can only propose plausible historical context, not absolute certainty. The Gospel writers deliberately refuse to indulge in speculative biography, maintaining an intentional restraint that sets them apart from the mythmakers of the ancient world. This evidentiary boundary does not weaken the Gospel accounts, it profoundly anchors their integrity. When human cultures construct mythical heroes, they crave unbroken spectacles and sensational childhood feats. The second-century Apocryphal writers could not endure the quiet, inventing flamboyant tales of a boy who commanded clay figures to fly or cursed his enemies in the street. By contrast, the four canonical Gospels preserved the quiet because the quiet was historical truth. Their deliberate silence stands as unintentional testimony to their sobriety. They recorded only what the public eyewitnesses beheld and what the salvation narrative required, leaving 18 years undisturbed in sacred obscurity. When we look back across the vast expanse between the boy of 12 standing in the Jerusalem temple and the man of 30 stepping into the swirling waters of the Jordan, the silence no longer feels like an omission. Those 18 unrecorded years were not a passive waiting room for a mission yet to begin. They were the forge in which the humanity of the Messiah was fully and completely lived. Picture the village of Nazareth as dusk settles over the high ridges of Lower Galilee. The heavy iron tools are laid against the limestone wall, the workbench swept clean of sawdust, and the smell of shaved cedar, dry straw, and burning olive oil hangs in the evening air. For nearly 7,000 consecutive days, no crowds gathered to applaud, no miraculous healings astonished the crowds, and no scribes sat at his feet to record memorable parables. Yet in that relentless obscurity, not a single hour was wasted. Every wooden plow shaped to fit the rocky earth, every tax coin counted under the watchful gaze of imperial collectors, and every uncelebrated Sabbath prayer in the Nazareth synagogue was an act of unrecorded fidelity. Before he spent 3 brief years teaching humanity how to die, he spent nearly 2 decades demonstrating how to live as an ordinary human being in a broken world. What we mistake for an absence is in truth the revelation of the sacred ordinary. The Gospels did not fall silent because there was nothing to tell, but because the truth was too profound for sensationalism. In withholding those 18 years, the ancient writers leave us with an enduring insight that the holiness of God does not begin when the world starts watching, but in the quiet, faithful labor where nobody knows your name.